right. Well, it seems like we're here. Those of us who are going to be here are here. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome or welcome back if you were here for any of the earlier sessions. But we're well into a series on the New Testament. I did two the last 2 weeks, and this will be my third and final, and then we're moving into some other guests. Next week is Nadia Bowles-Weber, and then professor from New Testament professor from the University of Denver. And so it's going to be a great series, and I encourage you to take a look at the other sessions and attend. Last 2 weeks ago, we did a general overview introduction to the New Testament, just in very broad terms. Last week we focused on the Gospels, and mostly we focused on the Synoptic Gospels. That's the first three that are closely related: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this time we're going to focus on the parables that are in the Synoptic Gospels. Actually, they're prevalent and prominent in the Synoptic Gospels, but there are no parables per se in the Gospel of John. It's another way in which the Gospel of John really is different from the Synoptic Gospels. Some of you might recognize this from, these are a couple shots from the movie Life of Brian, the Monty Python movie, where, Brian is this sort of accidental contemporary of Jesus and ends up accidentally having a bunch of followers, and he keeps trying to get rid of them and explain to them that he's not the one. And it's a very funny movie. Early on in it, there's a scene where it actually is Jesus teaching, but it's this crowd of people far away. And if you know Monty Python, it's always the same actors. And they're trying to hear what Jesus is saying way up on the mount there. And so they're telling each other to shut up so they can hear better and stuff. And they say, what did he just say? And this guy turns around and says, I think it was, blessed are the cheesemakers. And then the woman there says, what's so special about cheesemakers? And the guy mansplains to her, well, obviously it's not to be taken literally. It refers to any manufacturers of dairy products, and goes on from there. That isn't an actual parable, the blessed are the peacemakers, but it is relevant in terms of these questions of how we interpret and whether we take things literally, and what to make of some of the things that Jesus says. And that's really what we'll be talking about with the parables today. So first we'll ask, what is a parable, and talk a little bit about that in general. Then we'll ask Jesus why he insisted on using parables, which can be so confusing and frustrating and fascinating. And third, we'll read a few parables together. And if we were a little bit smaller Bible study type group, we could actually do that in a more conversational way. But I'll just offer some thoughts and questions, and in the Q&A time, we can continue to pursue those as we wish. Okay, so that's the plan. So what is a parable? Well, it was Jesus' signature teaching method, we can say. It's central. It's the central way of teaching in the Synoptic Gospels, as we said, not in the Gospel of John. Jesus uses parables to teach, both when speaking with his insider group, his disciples, his followers, as well as when he's addressing larger audiences, the crowds, as they're often called. And most, I would say, agree that this was not a common literary device in the first century, and most would argue that it's perhaps Jesus' unique teaching method that we find in these Gospels. We don't see a lot of other examples out there. I like to say, story-shaped metaphor. So, a metaphor associates something in a surprising way with something else. God is a rock. We're familiar with ones that associate, a name or a proper noun or a noun with another name or proper noun or noun. God is a rock. God is a mother eagle. God is a father. These are all metaphors, theological metaphors for God that associate God with something that is surprising, that is not obvious, right? That's how metaphors work. A metaphor becomes a dead metaphor when they just become equivalent, both sides. And I think we see that a lot with, for example, God as a father. Well, it's not a metaphor. That's not poetry. That's just literally true. God is a father. And stop talking about God using other pronouns and stuff like that. Because it's right there in the Bible. Well, that's a dead metaphor. It's no longer has that power of creating a tension that's surprising and that makes you think differently. And that's what metaphors do. There's this tension in them that kind of explodes out toward the listener or the reader, and makes us have to negotiate meaning in different ways, in a different way. It throws us off in a way and pushes us to make some meaning out of that association. So, yeah, normally metaphors are associating two things, right? But what we have in the parables is basically an unexpected association between an unfamiliar idea, namely the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. We'll talk more about that in a minute. On the one side of the metaphor, and on the other side, a story of some kind that's connected in some way to everyday life. It might be agriculture, it might be bread making, it might be commerce, it might be labor, but some sort of everyday life type story. So the metaphorical mode then of a parable is not an association of like kingdom of heaven is this, but it's the kingdom of heaven is associated with, and then a story on the other side of that metaphor. And so the mode might be something like this. This is my own parable. It's not God is a rock, but God is a rock on which a storm-tossed ship crashed and splintered to pieces in the night. People survived by clinging to the rock's jagged edges. The next morning, the sun rose in a clear blue sky, and they all gave thanks for their lives. That's what God is, right? So a metaphor that has an idea or concept on one side and a short story, in a way, on the other side. And a phrase worth remembering and keeping in mind is that this is an example of what we can call metaphorical theology. If you're interested in that and want to read more, I'd really recommend you go back to some of the early work by Sally McFaig, who was a feminist theologian at Vanderbilt University, and her early work was on metaphor and metaphorical theology, and then in her later work, she moved much more in the direction of eco-theology and ecofeminism, but she was still working from her metaphorical theological sort of underpinnings, foundation work, when she was moving into eco-theology. So coming up with different metaphors for God, for example, that open up different ways of thinking about our human relationship with the rest of the world. At any rate, this is an example of metaphorical theology. And so, how does this work on us? What does this do to us? What's the effect on us as hearers, as readers? And what does it say about Jesus' theology that this was his approach, that he would talk about the most important key concepts using metaphorical language, using something closer to poetry than to systematic theology or doctrinal statements or something like that. Clover is going to be talking, they're doing a series during Lent on Jesus as healer, Jesus as teacher. We were talking this morning about the fact that it's kind of related to metaphorical theology. Jesus asks something like, or is asked something like 120 some questions. I don't remember exactly how many, and only answers ever 8 of them. and in turn asks over 300 questions, right? So that's interesting to think about. What kind of a teacher is this? Is it about trying to nail down these theological concepts very clearly and systematically, or is it about opening up our imaginations in new ways? And I think that metaphorical theology does that, and it encourages us, invites us to come up with our own metaphors and to think creatively about our own sort of metaphorical imaginations when we're thinking about God, the kingdom of heaven, and so forth like that. Story-shaped metaphor. The central theme in the parables is the kingdom of God, or in the Gospel of Matthew, it's the kingdom of heaven. Oftentimes the same parables, but one starts with kingdom of heaven is like in Matthew, and the others start with kingdom of God is like in the two other synoptic Gospels. Yet Jesus never actually, as we were just saying, never actually defines what the kingdom of heaven is, because he mostly talks about it using the metaphorical language of parables that sort of talk around it and invite us into a space of reflection about it. When you read all of these parables and kind of reflect on them, you get some sense of maybe some parameters or some range of possible meanings related to the kingdom of heaven. It seems to be some kind of an alternative to the Roman Empire, to the order, the sociological, hierarchical order and ordering of power in the Roman Empire. It's full of surprises that are often frustrating, that often frustrate expectations. Think of the parable where the ones who start the day early and work all day get paid the same as the ones who show up right at the end, just in time to clock out, and they get a full day's pay. It's often, the kingdom of heaven is often impractical to the point of almost offensive, like really impractical. Wouldn't work, right? Something like that in the real world, that kind of a thing. At the same time, it is of ultimate value, and we'll talk about, we'll look at a couple parables that sort of get at that people will do anything for it. To acquire it or to realize it in some sense. The kingdom of heaven is now drawing near or at hand. We have that language less in the parables than in language around the parables in the gospel. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? But in what sense is the kingdom of heaven at hand? Does that mean it's coming soon or it's about to arrive? You know, something like that, like the reign of God's going to come down to earth and sort of take over the Roman Empire, or is it actually something that's already present and available, as it says, the kingdom of heaven is within you. I think that's in the Gospel of Thomas. So it's there for you to realize now and to live into now, that kind of realize what we sometimes think of as realized eschatology, a realization of this fulfillment in the present. But why, Jesus? Why do you do this? Why do you talk to us like this? Why do you teach us in this way? Why teach about your core idea, your core vision, the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven in such an ambiguous way, so open to different interpretations? Well, I think the main reason, we don't get any sort of clearly defined doctrinal, or as I just said earlier, doctrinal or theological sense of this idea of the kingdom of heaven or of God, is that Jesus is always talking about it in parables, appealing poetically rather than systematically to our theological imaginations, maybe more like a Zen master than a Protestant theologian. Indeed, sometimes, as in Matthew 13, which has a whole collection of parables, and all the ones that we'll look at today are from Matthew 13. Jesus just keeps hitting them with parable after parable after parable. Sometimes, as in Matthew 13, Jesus offers several parables in a row, piling metaphor upon metaphor with very little explanation or interpretation. How remarkable that the central theme of Jesus' teachings is treated poetically in this way, and what do we do with that, right? That's the kind of thing I really am hoping that we can reflect on. And I should say, too, that in many cases in the Gospels, there does follow the parable an explanation that will say something like, well, this kind of soil is that kind of person, this kind of soil is that kind of person, and this kind of soil is the good soil, it's you guys, or whatever. Or this, God is the head of the household, and these others. This stands for this stands for this. It turns it into a kind of symbolic, encoded story that then gets explained. Most would argue that those explanations come later, that the way Jesus used the parables was to leave them there, to be understood and made sense of by his hearers in their own ways, and that over time, remember that the Gospels that we have now written down came many decades later than the time of Jesus, that there developed over time explanations of the parables that became sort of standard. And so you do have some of those in the Gospels as well. I prefer to just try to read the parable on its own before jumping to the explanation that kind of turns it into a dead metaphor, if you will. And in fact, many times we have parables that are not explained or interpreted, and that's true in Matthew 13. Some of them are and some of them are not. And you get to the end, and Jesus has this sort of final parable, saying, that's, go and look at it, that's about the scribe of the kingdom of heaven, and you're sort of left thinking, huh? Which is kind of how the disciples were in chapter 13 and throughout a lot of the Gospels. I have a colleague who's actually a New Testament professor. I'm a Hebrew Bible person. She says that that it shouldn't be disciples, it should be the disciples. Especially in the Gospel of Mark. They never get anything. And we can identify with that, right? So, let's try some. How are we doing on time? Oh gosh, really good. Okay, lots of time to talk about them. So before we dive in, and these are selections from Matthew 13, but each of these parables also appear in other Gospels. As we explore these gems, let's resist the temptation to try to reduce each parable to a single straightforward meaning. Is the kingdom being associated with the first subject in the story? It's like a mustard seed, so is that the kingdom, the mustard seed? Or is it another subject in the same story, the one who planted the seed, the farmer, or the tree that grows from that mustard seed, or the birds that go and make their homes in that tree grown from that mustard seed? Or is the kingdom of heaven, is it with what takes place or changes in the story, going from small to big, for example, or spreading, for example, or something else? What is surprising about the association between the kingdom on the one hand and the story that is compared with it or put next to it? What is unexpected? How does this metaphor interact with others that Jesus offers here and elsewhere? Don't be discouraged if you don't find a clear picture of the kingdom of heaven emerging. And don't worry if you don't feel like you get it. Take comfort in the fact that the disciples didn't seem to get it either. They would often pull them aside later and say, explain that to us, would you? All right, so here is the first one we'll look at from Matthew 13. It's also in Mark and Luke and the Gospel of Thomas. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Now, this is a kind of an interesting one because in some way you could say the parable is that first part, right? The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in the field. End of story. But then there's a kind of annotation on what a mustard seed is that ends up telling a fuller story, right? It's the smallest of all seeds, but it grows and becomes the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree so that the birds of the air come and make nests in it. It becomes something completely different and becomes a home for other living beings. And of course, some of you will know that there's a lot of talk about this mustard seed and that it was a weed and it was invasive and things like that, which are interesting to think about too. That's all part of what we can kind of unpack here as we think about a parable like this, that it's a, I mean, what does it mean to call the kingdom of heaven, kudzu or Brazilian pepper or something like that? We had Brazilian pepper down in Florida when I was first teaching at Eckerd College, and I thought that's probably a good analogy. But yeah, so you've got that. You've got something going from small to big. We often think that the kingdom of heaven is that mustard seed that becomes the mustard plant. But is the kingdom of heaven actually this story of the planting of a mustard seed becoming something else? The taking and sowing of it could be, in some sense, what the kingdom of heaven is about. It could be about, yeah, like I said, small to big, or a becoming of a community. I'm just sort of thinking out loud of some of the possibilities, and we can keep talking about these. What I'll do is I'll leave these up and we can jump back and forth, and you all can share your thoughts as we do that. So that's one, a famous one. We had a little youth group song about it, I remember. Another, in the same, just right after that one, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. There's some great scholarship, by the way, on the sort of historical context and women's work and women's lives, and how much we can learn from parables about that, and how accurate some, these sorts of practices seem to be that are reflected in these brief parables. For example, the amount of flour, the amount of yeast, and so forth like that. But yeah, so here the kingdom is it like, if we think of it like the mustard seed one, is it the yeast? Is that what kingdom of heaven is? A kind of leavening that invades things and makes everything sort of rise, or that changes everything in some way, chemically even? Is it, and it's alive, right? Yeast is alive, is a living culture. Is it the story of a woman taking yeast and mixing it with 3 measures of flour and waiting for it to leaven? Is it the leavening? All kinds of possibilities for, and that's just a couple, and I think you all will probably have even better ideas. But again, hopefully you're already sort of getting the feeling for how these just kind of open up reflection in an imaginative way, and especially when you just pile one on top of the other, without trying to unpack one, figure it out, and then go on to the next one. Oop, didn't move. There it goes. What did that? Oh, that is the one. Yeah, sorry. I must have hit the button earlier. I like this one a lot. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. What do you think about this person? I think that when I was talking with my students and trying to get, like, do you understand that this is kind of a little tricksy here? Like imagine, let's say, you're test driving a used car in a lot, and you find inside the door panel, $100,000 cash, and so you go, and the car costs $5,000, and so you go and you sell all your everything you have to get the $5,000 and go and buy that car. That's what's going on here. He found a treasure, I think, unless the treasure is not very valuable and the stuff that he sold everything to get, was more valuable than the treasure itself, which is possible too, right? Which would be an impractical thing to do. And yet, that's possible. We don't know how big of a treasure it is, but it strikes me, one interpretation is that there's some kind of trickiness going on here, some kind of not entirely ethical behavior going on in order to acquire the kingdom of heaven in this particular story? Or do we go with the kingdom of heaven as the treasure, or as the hidden treasure, and sort of stop there? I think a lot of times we do get that language in kind of Christian discourse about the hidden treasure. But this is a story in which someone found it and then buried it over again and went and got some money and bought the land, right? So that's interesting. There's another that this next one is a little bit like it. Again, the kingdom of heaven, is it right after it? Yeah. Another treasure one. So the first two kind of had to do with stories about small to big, or isolated to spreading in some way, and these two are about treasure and doing something kind of radical or extravagant in response to or in order to acquire the treasure. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. So in terms of the story, I mean, there's a way in which that could actually make financial sense if that pearl of great value were worth as much or more than all the other ones, that all the other things, whether they were pearls or everything else that he had in order to buy it. On the other hand, it might not be a wise financial move. Is the kingdom the pearl of great price? We know that phrase, right? It comes from here, the pearl of great price. Is it the pearl of great value, or is it the merchant in search of pearls, or is it the search itself, or is it the transaction, the extravagance of the selling away of everything in order to find this, to have this one pearl? So many other possibilities. So I think I'd like to spend the rest of our time, we've got a good 20 minutes or so at least, just talking about these things, and also these parables, but also, if you have other questions about them that I might be able to field, and we can just have a conversation. This is a first try at this in this room. I'm used to doing this down in the fellowship hall, right, where we can move chairs around and stuff. I love teaching in this space, and it's such a warm, intimate space, even though it also feels spacious at the same time. But yeah, so we'll see how it goes. And Doug's got a microphone, so that if folks, and so I would invite thoughts or questions in relation to this parable or one of the earlier two, or general questions as well. Nancy.
What is the meaning of kingdom of heaven? Is it community of heaven? What does the word kingdom mean?
Yeah, so the Greek word is basileia, and it really is, this is a great question because there's not a good answer to it because he keeps using parables. But it would be basileia, which means basically kingdom or reign or rulership or something like that. We might, I don't want to define it too narrowly, but I think in the context of the Gospels, on the one hand, it's this notion of the reign of God as opposed to the reign of the empire, an alternative socio-political organization, not community, so potentially community, but initially it's a kind of affront to Rome in some way. It's an alternative order that with God as Lord rather than the emperor or something like that. But as it starts to unfold in these parables and in other teachings, it could start to look more like a community. It could start to look more like something very different from any sort of worldly notion of top-down imperial rule and power structure. So I think it's taking that word that does mean rulership, sovereign rulership or something like that, in a kind of imperial context, and then in the process of playing with it through the parables, maybe is redefining it in a rather radical way, so that by the end, where people don't get what they deserve, and where surprising things happen and impractical things happen, and where, as we sort of unfold the idea of the gospel into, say, Galatians 3:28, there is neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek. It's a breaking down of barriers, and a different sort of idea of community begins to emerge that's tied to, I think, the redefinition of basileia here. That's just my thought about that, but... Yeah. He's going to come with the mic, so...
What about, like, the purpose or the interpretation of heaven being who is speaking or interpreting it? And not just interpreting it, but, like, actually speaking. So you could say, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in the search of pearls, or again, this kingdom of heaven. What if, like, that way is kind of like Jesus saying that heaven is what we see it as? If heaven is the interpretation of the individual.
No, that's great. Great reflections. And I hear a couple questions in there. One is related to something we talked about in the first week or the second week. I can't remember. I guess the second week, which is, we don't know what Jesus sounded like. We don't know what this sounded like, and it's actually so important, and yet it's completely unavailable to us. So, in Luke 4, when Jesus reads from Isaiah in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing," and we know that Jesus probably would have actually been canting that, singing that scripture in a kind of melodic, rhythmic way. We have no access, we have no in our hearing for that, except in a worship context where we bring it to life in our own way. And I think in some sense, so it's unavailable. The inflection and the interpretation that would have been in the sound, the way it was presented orally, we have no access to. And neither did the gospel writers, because that was decades later from, they were not eyewitnesses of these events either. So that's fascinating. And what, to me, that opens up is related to your second point about understandings of heaven could be very different for different people, different listeners, different hearers, different readers, because it means that we are left with our imaginations to try to relive or to bring to life the event of that teaching, and we are not we are on the hook as interpreters and as imaginers to do that work, and we should do that in community and in conversation, which is why these parables are so great for inviting that kind of reflection together. So I think that's great comment, great question. Thank you.
Tim, I was intrigued last week.
Oh, there you are.
Larry asked a question, did Jesus write? Were there manuscripts that we could accredit to Jesus? And as you answered, not that we know of. And these stories, these accounts are told decades later. And what you had mentioned earlier about perhaps the explanation that we find was more the opinion of the writer.
Or it was an explanation that also became part of the oral tradition that ended up in the Gospels.
Yeah, so I just find it all really fascinating. Again, I see also in Thomas, and then I realize, well, Thomas got excluded from these Gospels, and just how much influence decades later are part of our New Testament.
Yeah, Me too. Yes, and we might have mentioned this last week too, that when we were talking about the synoptic problem, and something that both Matthew and Luke have in common that is not in Mark is a lot of sayings of Jesus that scholars will attribute to something called Q, which is for a German word that means source, a source that Matthew and Luke had that Mark did not have. That's one of the hypotheses that tries to explain that. And many would say it probably was something like the Gospel of Thomas, if not the Gospel of Thomas, because Thomas is just a collection of sayings. There's no interpretive annotation. There are no stories, action, or anything like that in the Gospel of Thomas. So it could be argued that one early strain of tradition, of gospel tradition, was a collection of sayings that didn't have the infrastructure of narrative around them, but that was just a collection of teachings, of sayings. Again, it kind of reminds me of like a collection of Zen koans or something like that. But yeah, we don't have access. We don't have evidence that allows us to kind of reconstruct those kinds of things. And I think that, again, that may be sort of unnerving in some ways, because it leaves us, like I said, on the hook. We're left with the freedom and the obligation to interpret and imagine and make meaning when we don't have everything to sort of get it handed to us. That can be terrifying, but I hope it can also, in a context of community, be empowering and inviting.
Tim,
Hey, Dave.
You were saying that John doesn't have any parables, and I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about how that, if there's any clues as to how that came about, because you indicated that parables were Jesus' unique way of teaching.
Yeah.
And to not include that seems...
Yes, right. According to the Synoptic Gospels and the evidence from them, a unique way of teaching from Jesus that seems to not have been as important to the tradition that the Gospel of John is associated with. And, I'm not a scholar of the Gospel of John or even of the Synoptic Gospels, but generally speaking, it's pretty clear that the Gospel of John just reflects, sort of like maybe the Gnostic Gospels did, reflects not in the same way, but a different strain of early Christianity that was built around, that gathered around these stories that are different, that have different timelines, and are built, the Gospel of John is built around miracles, and John's Jesus speaks in a very different way. You know how the Gospel of John begins. Within the beginning was the Word, and it's very philosophical, and there's that kind of Beatles sounding, I am you, and I am in God, and you are in me, and we are we, and we are all together. Goo 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 jube. So that very philosophical kind of, and some would say maybe even a little bit Gnostic, like this, gnosis just means knowledge, but that there's almost a sense of a kind of secret knowledge that Jesus is conveying to the disciples and to the followers that the others outside it don't get in the same way. And that's a very different way of thinking about Jesus than what we have in the Synoptic Gospels. And it's coming.
This is an observation more than a question, but I'm just thinking about the woman with the pearl, with the yeast. The women making bread with yeast. First of all,
I like
God
to think
is
that the
female
merchant
there.
was a woman, though.
Yeah, the important. Yeah, of course, that's one vision of God as a woman.
Yeah.
But look at what she's doing, which is what many women do, is a very small thing, making food, putting the very small grains of yeast into bread. So many of us are doing the small things all the time, over and over. And, but we don't know what's going to happen with them and what effect they may have down the road. Okay, it's not a question.
That'll preach. No, I love it though. That it doesn't have to be I don't need questions. I think that's a beautiful interpretation of that, and opens up a whole nother dimension, right, around the simple acts that unfold in expected or unexpected ways. That they're not dramatic. The second two, right, are very dramatic. Selling everything you have to acquire something. This is not dramatic. This is every day. I like that. It's good. Judd.
Hi, Tim.
Hey, Judd.
This is great.
Thanks.
I think maybe it's an observation, not a question.
Hold it a little closer.
An observation, not a question. Having just come from hearing Ian's sermon, I'd like to suggest that parables are Jesus' solution to the blah, blah, blah problem.
Yes, that parables are Jesus' solution to the blah, blah, blah problem. I know that's in Ian's sermon. I haven't heard it yet because I was getting ready for this. But yes, I like that. It's because they really do interrupt the blah, 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 right? And open up a different kind of space.
Like the Zen koan.
Yes, like a koan does, absolutely. Yep. Koans work a little bit differently, don't they? But they have the same effect. Yeah.
I think about the digital world that we live in.
Yeah.
And the ways that have been invented to get your eyes.
Yeah.
And if you do advertising or anything and it doesn't get or keep eyes, blah, blah, blah.
Blah, blah, blah. Right. That's good. So Judd said, thinking about in our digital environment, our media environment today, all of the strategies and tactics we develop through different media to get attention and keep attention. And the parable is a kind of strategy. And metaphors are too, and poetry is too. These are rhetorical strategies. If Walter Brueggemann were here, he would want us to be talking about how these texts, these stories work on us, what they do to us, their affective power, their power to affect us, and to grab us and hold us in some way. And I think that is what we're talking about here. If you're interested in reading more about metaphor in those sorts of ways and the way it works rhetorically, to hold attention, to sort of disorient the mind in some way that forces it to sort of renegotiate things. There's Sally McFaig's book, Metaphorical Theology, which is it's a pretty challenging read, but it's definitely worth the work. And behind that, she was drawing from the work of a philosopher named Paul Ricoeur. Paul Ricoeur, very, very important, famous philosopher, wrote an essay in a journal that you probably know, Judd, Semea, which was this experimental journal of biblical studies that was very much focused on linguistics back in the 70s and 80s. And I think it might just be called Biblical Hermeneutics, but it's a very long essay by Paul Ricoeur that is about the parables. And that's where he works out this notion of parables as metaphorical, that basically they refer outside of themselves to the reader because they hold this tension that can't just stay inside the parable. And so it kind of explodes out toward the reader who has to do something with it. So it grabs attention. It recruits, I think he maybe even says recruits the reader, but some sort of language like that, or captures. So I think that's a great thing to think about, this early media strategy, rhetorical strategy. Mm-hmm. Yes?
So this kind of leads into a question that I have. You mentioned that this is an unusual teaching method for the period. How do we know that? I missed last week, so I don't know if that came up before, but can you talk a little bit more about that? And can you talk a little bit more about context with other religious texts? Like, non-Christian texts, do they use this kind of metaphor to get people to think about what they're aiming at?
I mean, okay, good question, really good question. How do we know? And that's kind of why I said why I had in that little bullet point, most would say, probably, perhaps, signature teaching method, because all that means is we don't have other examples out there that are prevalent. It doesn't appear to be a prevalent method from the other surviving literature. But, if we didn't have the Gospels and if the Jesus movement hadn't taken off, we would never have known about Jesus either, and never have known about this sort of teaching method either. And who knows whether he might have learned it from someone else, or might have had his own teacher who used and modeled this way of teaching. All we have is what survives, and it's such a tiny fraction of the total of what was circulating at the time. I do think that the parable as a kind of literary device or rhetorical device is more prevalent, mostly from the influence of these very culturally popular and significant and widely known parables in the Gospels. Yeah.
So I noticed for a lot of this, we're looking at kingdom of heaven as a phrase, but what if we separated it up? So say heaven is like yeast, but the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that the woman took. What are we really looking at? Are we looking at what is heaven, or are we looking at what is the kingdom of heaven that God rules?
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. Great question. So if we think about, we've got two parts here, right? In this construct phrase, kingdom of heaven, and of course in the other two Gospels, it's kingdom of God. So then you have to do that in a different way. On the one hand, you can read it as a whole phrase and say, well, this is a different kind of kingdom. Back to Nancy's question, this is one from on high. Uranos, heaven means something like that, from the skies or something like that, or of God. It's an alternative kingdom. But then if we want to break it apart like you're suggesting and associate kingdom with certain parts of the parable and associate heaven or God with other parts of the parable, I think that we're free to do that too and see what that opens up as well. I mean, we're invited to do that because we're not instructed on how we're supposed to read them, right? So that's a great idea. Oh,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, that's all
Hi.
right. I have a couple of questions about oral tradition. Over the generations of oral tradition, the Hebrew oral tradition, how accurately does it translate from generation to generation? Are there interpretations? Do they bring it into more contemporary language? And also, as far as the scriptures, were they written from an oral tradition, people telling the stories of what Jesus said, or simply from the apostles' memories, what they remembered from decades earlier?
Good questions. And I'm not an expert on oral literacy or oral transmission of texts, but we can kind of, speculate in a general way that it would probably be all of the above to some degree. We looked at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke last week, where the writer of the Gospel of Luke says, inasmuch as, and these stories have been handed down to us from those who were eyewitnesses. That's some kind of a reference to followers of Jesus who remembered them. And inasmuch as others have undertaken to try to gather all these sources together, which could be oral and written, in order to sort of put it all together, I too have undertaken to do this work. And that suggests, a combination of sources, maybe oral and written, and it could be that it probably would be, I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that certainly these oral traditions would have been written down earlier too, than the time when the Gospels were written, and might have become sources for the written Gospels. The fact that the wording is so close, in 3 different Gospels would suggest, some kind of, not standardized, but something more than a fixed oral memory of exactly what was said, right? But you do have things like, Sermon on the Mount versus Sermon on the Plain. Which women were there at the empty tomb? And clearly there were different oral traditions and memories of those things that came up with different answers to what happened where and when and who was there. And the different Gospels, either they had the one source and used it, or maybe they looked at the different ones and decided which one to use. But so there was variety that had to have been related to just the ways oral and handwritten text circulated and was copied and distributed in this non-hierarchical, decentralized Jesus movement.
I just Googled the origin of parables.
Oh,
and it raised a question for me in that it comes from a Greek word, and it's associated with Aesop, who goes back to the 6th century BCE. And when I think of Aesop, I think of fables. So what's the difference between a fable and a parable?
I think what's the similarity is it's a made-up story, right? I mean, parabola. It's a made-up story. Maybe it makes sense that word, goes back to Aesop and to the idea of fable. What Jesus is doing with it, of course, is putting a made-up story next to a theological concept, an important, message of the gospel for Jesus, right? But these aren't historical stories. They're historically accurate. We talked about, that's not the right way to put it. They are realistic. They're, but they're not things that happened in a particular instance. Sometimes they're things that happened all the time. Well, I think that we are at a good stopping point. It's 25 after. And I hope this has opened you up and empowered you to look at these and play with these yourselves and just sort of see what that does for you. I think it's interesting to consider also writing your own parables. Sometimes you can surprise yourself with what, as you write a story and it sort of unfolds and surprises you in the ways it unfolds, it can also surprise you in terms of the ways it opens up your own theological imagination, your own thinking about God, the kingdom of heaven, and these kinds of things. So thank you. Thanks for your great questions and insights.